we have time for some discussions, and should I moderate or wait a minute, I can moderate the room, but people on Zoom who have questions, maybe you can quickly just comment, write on the comment, I have a question, I have a question, or a question, and then I will go through them in order as I see them, but first, let me ask if any of you have questions, comments, and okay. So there's already one in the screen, but
maybe start with it?
yeah, yeah, please. Who start KK? From the
Yoko and yourself.
yeah, but this is Katsuya Konishi-san. I saw Jim. Jim has a question too. Let me take Jim and then to this Konishi-san. Right?
Yeah. I have so many questions for all of you, but let me just begin in order with the first paper. That's the only one I'll ask now. Because people have questions. You talked about bodily harm as a response to racial exclusion. And I have two things that bother me about that initially are that in addition to the negatives, isn't it also a positive affirmation of one's own racial identity? So there's two sides. The second thing is I wonder about the word racial because it seems so vague, like a waste paper category, or putting all sorts of things in. Maybe cultural, religious, ethnic, and it might make a difference depending on which one of those you choose. That's just about the general statement. My question is this: do you think that the theory that you're working on would be of any help to explain what to me is completely unexplainable? The suicide bombers who criticize their exclusion by killing people and at the same time affirm their own religious identity. So it's just a question of the usefulness of the theory. Do you think it could be expanded to include that, or are they completely different problems?
Should we collect questions or should I directly answer? Yeah. So to the first question, I would say that there's a variety of different aspects that have to be taken into consideration. On the one hand, like showcase dehumanization and exclusion is one particular notion that is embedded, at least in our, at least how we would interpret this kind of self-harming practices. But on the other hand, I would totally agree with you that it's that it has to also be interpreted as an act of regaining agency and also asking the question in an affirmative way. I'm also human. Don't you see it? I'm also human. I feel the same pain as you feel, right? I mean, like, no matter what the color of my skin is, I also want to be recognized as a human being. So in that sense, I would totally agree with you that there is also this kind of this positive notion to it.
But my positivity was a little different.
Okay.
Yours, it goes from I'm excluded because of my race.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so please accept me because I'm a human being. And I was saying if they're excluded because of your race, wouldn't your self-harm develop? Wouldn't that also be an affirmation of your racial identity? For you, it seems to be like an evaporating of it into a general humanity.
Okay, I see.
That's my question. Is that an element there?
Yeah, I mean, so in the sense that that what is expressed is not solely something like see I'm human as well, but see that that I, for example, as a Black person, want to be considered and recognized. So yeah, I would agree with this, of course, yes. And as for the second question, you know, this what I basically take from Mills, from Charles Mills and critical race studies or the critical race perspective is this idea of sub-personhood, this idea of being denied moral status equality. And I actually would hesitate to expand this kind of notion to this practice of suicide bombers, because there this idea of, I mean, there's a huge difference between using oneself as a means to kill others in contrast to harming oneself but not others, in the sense like to, you know what, and I think that there's a huge difference in this particular practice, and that's why I think I haven't thought of it. So I think it's a beautiful question. I haven't thought of it, but I would say that we need a different conceptual vocabulary to unpack this practice.
Konishi-san has a question from the Zoom. If you could turn your microphone on.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this very insightful.
Wait a minute. Sorry, is this Julia? Yeah.
Yes.
There's
Sorry.
Mr. Konishi, I have to take the questions in order. So your question comes
sorry.
up next.
ごめんなさい。
Hi.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Yoko-san, Arisaka-san. Thank you very much for illuminating presentation, Professor Volk. I have two questions. One is empirical and one is the political. I'm a journalist and a political science by training. I understand the case that you had started off with, the case of the two gentlemen. I guess they are a Iranian nationality in Western society, I guess.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
In Germany,
Yeah.
right? So, are there any cases known that the Muslim nationals detained or in cells that had committed the self-inflicting protest in the authoritarian regimes, not in liberal democracies? Like, for example, we have a Navgan Mohammadi. Ms. Mohammadi had received a Nobel Peace Prize for the government protest in Iran, and she had ventured a couple of hunger strike, but she has not really resorted to any inflicting physical inflicting corporeal the protest herself. So I'm just curious if you have any empirical case where the Muslim nationals engaging in self-inflicting protest in authoritarian regimes, or in Iran or in Syria or any other countries, not in liberal democracies. So that's one question. So let's take it from at that.
Okay. Well, this is very anecdotal. I mean, we focused on the practice in this paper. We focus on the on protest within Western liberal democracies related to what is very often referred in Europe the so-called migration crisis, right? And the change of migration policy in Europe over the last, let's say, 15 to 20 years. But what I know is like that you have in the fight of the Kurds against for autonomy, for example, in Turkey, they very often also used self-harm as a kind of protest practices. But I haven't looked into protest practices within authoritarian regimes yet. So, which is a very interesting perspective, I would say, and especially you have a kind of also a kind of tradition of some protest practices as I said, for example, in the Kurdish tradition, you have a kind of a history of protest that uses the body and uses self-harm as a means of protest. You also have this, as you just referred to, in the Iranian tradition, where this is very often also used, especially and you probably know also from like hunger strikes in prisons, where it is often used. What is kind of typical, or what is kind of interesting about the situation in Western democracies is the thing that on the one hand you kind of make use of the right to freedom of assembly, so you gather in the public, so all of the other practices are mostly hidden and happen within prisons, for example, but this is something that happens publicly, and you do it although your legal status is somehow precarious. So, and you take this step, you are a kind of deportable person. You very often then get deported, and this is like what we found somehow, not unique but striking about this specific protest practice. Yes.
The reason what I'm driving at is perhaps that the case that you start off with has how much does the case have to do with the Muslim in liberal democracies? How can you how much can you generalize when you consider a different national from different cultural background engaged in different modes of protest? You know, I think the protest is a kind of a political communication. You know, I see it as a sort of a intake of the protesters and the reaction by the given society. So if you're in a liberal democracy, obviously you have some sort of repertoire of different modes of protest, like civil disobedience, some kind of violence, and so on, within the legal framework or outside of the legal parameters. So if you are dealing with this kind of self-inflicting kind of ultimate modes of protest, how much would that have to do with the cultural, the propensity of the individual, given the different cultural milieu, like liberal democracies? So the you talked about the Kurds in Turkey. The Turkey is obviously has a more freedom than Iran in certain respect, but it is also a repressive regime, and they have their own media that could work as an echo chamber of the protest incidents. However, it cannot be equated with the liberal democracies like Germany or France. So What I'm saying is that the with that kind of self-inflicting the incidents has any political or sociological or philosophical meaning to it, how much can you consider the sort of the interaction between the protesters or the incidents, the protesters that engaged in the incidents, and the host countries, the nature of host countries?
Okay, thank you.
Well, the example I used at the beginning was not meant to generalize it. It was just an example because the refugee tent action movement became very famous in Germany. So that was its initial starting point. I do not even know if Muhammad, the person, if he was Muslim. He came out of a Muslim society, but I do not know if he was like a religious person or so. So he came out of this society. That's clear. He fled the country. That's also clear. But we have empirical evidence from a lot of camps, for example, on Lesbos, on the Greek islands, but also in other detention centers from people from Africa who are using these kind of protest practices of self-harming. So it is but I'm absolutely right. So the example at the beginning could provoke exactly this kind of question, and we have to deal with also in the upcoming weeks and months, when we try to write more about in this paper and make progress with this paper, that we kind of also refer to specific, let's say, a specific history in different cultures of self-harm as a protest practice. But here it was just an example, not meant to draw from this particular case any generalizable conclusions. But the empirical data is very clear that in social movement studies is very clear with the data that self-harm protest practices that include self-harm is prominent within migrants' protests. So we have plenty of examples from the different detention centers and so on.
Okay, thank you. We have 1, 2, 3 questions lined up for actually 4. We just go in the order that they showed up. So Julia, maybe you can ask all of your 3 questions, and then.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I will be very quickly. I'm a former student of Professor Kazashi, and now I'm a PhD candidate in Chinese law. So my background is slightly different. I will be very quick. Thank you very much for the event. So first, a question to Professor Kazashi. First of all, I really appreciate the way you lectures, because you always shows the human behind the work, the human behind the theory, the human behind the artist. And my question is about Tsurumi, because in the first slide about him, you refer to him with the expression philosophy for a democratic form of life. So my question is, what is this democratic form of life? My question for Professor Hoerning. I found your speech extremely interesting from my perspective, because I'm studying Chinese law and I'm a Western. So there is a lot of debate around it, around comparative law, but also the theory of law in general. And regarding special binaries, I think that maybe the case of China could be interested, because what I observe is that China, at least the main literature on this topic, is trying to bring up a new concept, which actually is belongs to the ancient Chinese theory, and is tianxia, so all under even. The idea that the world is a whole entire politic entity, so it's unified. But the only characteristic is that this tianxia, this all under even, has China as a Zhongguo, which is actually the Chinese name of China and means the kingdom in the middle. So it's a new way of also interpreting international relations, but is like the main way now in sociological political science studies within China. This is like comment / question, and also another comment about your topic. From a law perspective, actually still in China, urban and rural binaries are normative categories because Chinese people are, they have to register through the system of hukou. And if you are urban or a rural citizens, you have different civil rights in terms of buying a house, renting, or even moving from one city to another. So for me, it was very interesting, like your speech. And my last question to Professor Volk, very briefly. So this self-inflicted harm, self-inflicted body harm, and the question, what does it mean in a democratic liberal society? My question is, have you collected interviews from people that did it? And is there constructed theoretical thought within those people? Like there is, yes, an idea behind the act himself. I hope I was clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to quickly?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Julia. And I'm glad to see you. And it looks like you're doing fine. And I hope you can finish your PhD as scheduled. Now, as for your question, just trying to be brief, and I think we need to make a clear distinction between pragmatism as a sort of a way of philosophical thinking associated with USA, America, and the real actual the existing political entity of the USA. So, but historically, usually it is said that pragmatism was sort of launched by a group of young American philosophers, the gathering in Cambridge, and after the Civil War, the war between the South and the North in the USA. And it was a very terrible fight and killing each other within the USA, right? So I think there was a sort of motif, philosophical motif. What can we avoid killing each other and resorting to war and trying to come to terms with each other? And that was the motif behind the birth of pragmatic thinking, some people say. And that is to say, so it is a sort of a way of mediation, at least as sort of originally invented. It is a way to try to come to terms among different pluralist viewpoints. So if we say it is a democratic form of a life or form of thinking, it may sound optimistic, but actually it was, to the contrary, there's a very clear realization that compromises are really necessary in order to lead democratic sort of society without resorting to a real physical fighting. So, and that was basically what I meant. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think, thank you very much.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Shall I continue? Thank you, Julia. Really brilliant comments. And I thought a lot I gained a lot of inspiring thoughts from your comments too. So starting with the East-Western distinction and the Chinese conception of ciencia, I think it was. I think this is really interesting. The thing that I thought about right immediately was world system theory and Wallerstein. So because you think of the world as basically having a core, a center, and a periphery, but being an entire world. So that's what world system theory, well, in a very banal way, if you describe it in a banal way, is about. So this would be interesting to see. And of course, what you can see thereby also is that the conceptualization of the binaries is one of positionality. And the positionality in Ciencia is also quite visible if you see that what you said, that China as a kingdom in the middle, this is also an expression of positionality. I think what we ought to understand is that they are expressions of positionality, and we perceive the world through these positionalities. So I think what would be really interesting is to relate them and also to study the similarities and differences also between those different conceptualizations, because what I would be interested in is to understand how much of a core the kingdom is and how much of a periphery the rest of the world is, and how much of an even world it can be understood. So this would be, to me as a sociologist, I'm always basically the first thing that I'm interested in is inequalities that show up, structural inequalities that show up in there. And the same applies to urban and rural. And I know the Hukou system, and I think this is exactly what this points towards, to understand urban and rural as political categories. They are administratively enacted as such, but they're also through relations between different social groups enacted as such. It's not only administratively a political category, but it's also through the regulations of property and access to rights, as well as territory and land. So I think this is a brilliant example for that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Julia, for your question. Yes, we have interviews. This is as I mentioned at the beginning, I write this paper together with a colleague. Her name is Laura Gorjan, and we are part of. We work together for many years. We are in a bigger research project where we study protest, so different types of protest. And Laura's project she's about to finish her PhD, hopefully within the next 2 or 3 months, is on migrants protest. And she conducted many interviews also with people who were involved in the refugee tent action and others who used self-harm as a practice of protest. And what we hear or what we get from these interviews is, we demand rights. We tried everything. We don't want to live like this anymore. But as I try to, or your question somehow helps me to make a distinction here, namely between what I would call the conditional relationship. So what are the conditions that make something happen? For example, ask the people, and how do they describe what leads them to do, what motivates them to act like this? So this is like looking at the conditional relations, the conditions that make something happen. And then in contrast to this, not totally separated, but somehow separated, still connected, is making sense of what is happening. So this is something different, like making sense of endeavor. What does it mean? What happens? And this is what we are doing in this little article, like interpreting what happens. So, and it is important to, of course, to listen to the people who do it, but then it is our task somehow to take it from there and connect it with a, with a theoretical perspective on the context in which it happens. So this is this creative, let's say, creative endeavor of political theorizing in that sense. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I will consistently take the questions in order. So next will be Gan Iwen.
Okay. Thanks for your time. And I'm a Chinese student of Akita International University, now under the supervision of Professor Konishi. And yeah, I'm from China, and I'm basically living authoritarian regime. And I think will be very interesting to ask a question for Professor Christian Volk. And because your project is like Connie Sensei said before, like your project focusing on the self-harming, the protesting liberal democracy. But I think from China, because I had a lot of experience with protesting, and I see a lot of people are actually doing like self-harming and self-inflicting activities and protests, especially the case with minority people in Tibet or in Xinjiang, which is the territory occupied by Uyghurs. And they're doing, especially like 10 years ago, they were doing a lot of self-emanations. But actually the public opinion with them are very, very different from, I think, Western media. Because they were saying if they're doing self-emanation or self-harming, so they are just like barbarians, because they don't know how to behave civilizedly. And they all often have those pictures of people who doing like self-harmings, especially in the jail or in prison or in public, and calling them like terrorists or people who are brainwashed or people who don't know how to like negotiate, how to communicate. So self-harming is kind of interpreted as kind of really terrorist, non-communicative act in China. And that's in our education. They show those pictures of a self-emanation, self-harming in our education, in our textbook, telling people that those people are very bad, those people are brainwashed, they're cultish. So I think it's very interesting to see why like Western media, Western audience and Chinese media react to this self-harming activity in such a like very like polarized way. So that's my question.
Interesting.
Yeah, great question. And of course, I cannot answer it, because what needs to be done is a deep investigation on what's going on there, right? But let me just say one thing: the media reaction in Western societies towards this kind of self-harm is, of course, also not positive, right? I mean, we have hardly any media coverage of these cases at all. So this is the first thing. So, and the second thing is that on the political level, the communication is more like expressing a deep misunderstanding for these kinds of deeds, right? So why do they do this? So we simply don't understand. So they fled all the way from, I don't know, like Kenya or Ghana to Europe. They are here. They are safe, and now they do this kind of self-harm. So I don't understand. Very often it is individualized, and it is referred back to psychological psychological errors, so to say, right? So maybe they experience trauma on their way to Europe, but it has nothing to do. This is at least, in mainstream, it has nothing to do with the conditions they face here. Of course, we also have critical journalism that is somehow digging deeper here at this point. But what I want to say is that I'm not representing in my talk, I'm not representing how this self-harm is perceived in Western society. I'm doing kind of my own creative reinterpretation, but what is super interesting is and what I take from your statement is that there is, to generalize self-harm is over different cultural and political contexts is actually impossible. So you need to analyze the political context in which something is happening, the social context in which something is happening, as this kind of protest is happening, in order to unpack the meaning of these practices. So.
Okay, we have two more questions on the floor, Professor Hoerning and then Professor O'Leary. Anybody else? And then, sorry, and you're the last.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to address Kristen's contribution and also Professor Kazashi, sorry.
No, that's all right.
I was looking at different names. Professor Kazashi, and I'll start with Kristen because we've been talking quite a lot about and discussing it, and I think one interesting aspect that I thought, and relate back to your first question that you asked, is actually how can we understand this also comparatively? Because I think, yes, you're right. What you pointed out towards now is that we have to all understand and analyze these phenomena within the context that they are produced and they're enacted. At the same time, the question that you asked is about the relationship between a specific political practice and a democratic or political system. And this relationship, I think, is really interesting. And I think what struck me with the different two concepts, and I'm pushing towards the open questions because I think this is interesting to look at. One is the enacting of subpersonhood and the other is the enacting of citizenship. And I think the interesting thing is because if we look at enacting subpersonhood, I can think of many historical examples of that, right? If you think of gendered inequalities, if you think of also even historically, workers have been really addressed as bodily different in the historical context, and not only culturally, bodily, in any way, emotionally, effectively, in every way. So this enacting of subpersonhood seems to be something that, and in this sense, it's maybe not so helpful to relate only to liberal democracy, because it seems to be the way that that relationship between a political system and inequalities and discriminations within the societies that lie at the heart of any, not even democratic, authoritarian, whatever regime we're looking at. And so this question is probably one of the really central questions in order to understand political regime and social inequalities and the relationship to one another. And what I'm thinking is that looking at this specific type of protest, seems to me it's kind of we require this combination of enacting subpersonhood and enacting citizenship, because only through both of these concepts am I able to understand and grasp the specific nature of this kind of conflict that arises here. And I'm just going to leave it at this comment and something that we can think about together. And my question to you, Professor Kazashi, is actually on the manga and how the drawing of the manga. I think it was really interesting because, I mean, also one of the pictures that you showed was the lion. And then you mentioned that it's kind of, it picks up a Disney-fied version of drawings. So to me, my question was, I do see the relationship between political thinking and the drawing as not just a way of expressing entertaining, but expressing a being in the world. But my question would be if that kind of drawing is also something that integrates different types of cultural meaning production. So it seems like a cultural practice and a visual symbolization of meaning as an exchange between different languages of art, discourse, of ideology. And this, in my case, I would then think, okay, are the binaries here interrelated? Are they not distinguishable anymore, or are the mangas to be understood as representations of cultural location? This is like kind of the question that I would ask, and I would like to address is like how much of a cultural locational expression is the manga, and how much of a interrelated cultural expression is it? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know who wants to start.
Please go first.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And I have to be brief, but first of all, and just like in political thinking, in popular culture, also particularly in manga culture, there are so many artists and a variety of mangas produced. And it is particularly true today, I think. And we cannot follow all of them. An enormous number. And so I think we need to keep it in our mind that the sheer variety of artists and topics, and also the way they made mangas. And in the case of Tezuka, it is said that, interestingly, as a small child, and there was a very strong sort of influence from his mother, because his mother read out the mangas to small Tezuka. And Tezuka watched many very sort of, primitive movies, or not primitive, but movies made during the war times. In the US, also in German. And also in the case of the US, there was a very clear sort of influence from Walt Disney. And that's very clear. But I think, actually, we call it manga, but I think there are, as I said, very different types of mangas. And there are funny mangas on the one hand, but there are very dead serious mangas, and which is called with a different name, actually, getting a theatrical, dramatic sort of paintings. And so I think the kind of lines used are different in a very serious types, and rather angular, very strong lines are used. And this is the one clear feature. But I think, particularly in the case of the Tezuka, he tried to invent new ways. For example, getting ideas from the movie makers too. So it is said that the way Tezuka drew his mangas are really sort of a product of inspiration he got from the movies. And so going back to your question, I think not only in popular culture, also in philosophical thinking too. I think after the 70s, after the economic growth, the basic motifs and the themes are changed quite a lot. So we cannot make a generalization, but I think I hesitate to make a generalizing connection between the, the sort of main ideological thinking and the way the painters makes But let me think just briefly. I think there was the third sort of talent of Japanese manga in post-war Japan, which was much more directly socially, politically oriented. And so sort of taking up the theme of social political resistance. And in that case, I think, as I said, the lines are not go to Disney-like and much more angular and straight. Yeah.
We hear Professor O'Leary's question, and then Christian can sort of close up with your comments and answers.
I think mine might connect with Jim, but I'm rather confused by the whole discussion. Two things that resonated with me very much today. First of all, this self-harming tradition as a tradition of protest. We should be very careful dealing with that. And there's a pluralism of, as I think someone said, there's a pluralism of understandings of what self-harming protest can mean. Even within the Irish tradition of hunger strike, there's a pluralism. My school in the North Manor Cork, we venerated Terence McSweeney, who was the most famous hunger striker perhaps of all. He was the mayor of Cork, and as soon as he was appointed mayor, he said, I will use the hunger strike, a political weapon, and he died over 74 days. Wonderful, adored, okay, fine. But then you have Bobby Sands, who was admired in Tehran. There's a street named after him. Now I begin to understand that there's a hunger strike tradition in Iran. But Bobby Sands is by no means admired. He has a cult following. But he's a bit like what the Chinese man there said, think about the Uyghur hunger strikers, Bobby Sands. And a classmate of mine was the brother of one of the hunger strikers who died with him. And who was telling him in the night before he died, you'll be with Bobby Sands in heaven tonight. Excuse me, this is ridiculous. It is use of the hunger strike as a weapon, yes, but it's moral blackmail. And if you're a member of a terrorist organization, you have consigned countless people, innocent people, to death. And the fanaticism involved is also extremely dangerous. Now, the opposite of all this is liberal democracy. Goethe, oh lovely, I love him. I love Goethe, he's my favorite writer. But Goethe himself, liberal democracy is rather weak. It's always weak. And in Goethe's case, it's weak. And, Nabokov denounced Goethe as a vulgar, flamboyant master of Poschlust. I think that's the name, which means sheer vulgarity. D.H. Lawrence denounced him for godifying himself. And Goethe and Thomas Mann dismantled him magnificently in a very amazing novel called Lotte in Weimar. The Beloved Returns in English. And Goethe himself, as I just discovered, said, I wish I lived in South Sea Island, because he knew his whole show was a fake. Now, what is the balance between all these conflicting factors? Why not Christianity? You go to Weimar, seek, and you should not find, because there's not a single Christian item in the vast collection of beautiful pagan artifacts that Goethe collected. Goethe shunned funerals. He enjoyed his life, and that's why we love him. He makes us all enjoy our life, and he makes the creativity flow like wine. Yeah. But he's not the moral answer. So that's what I'm saying. At both ends of the spectrum, which is my lovely liberal democracy, and we should never speak ill of it now before the election, sorry. And my highly ambiguous Irish background, I say, let us just think, let us be skeptical, and let us keep our seatbelts fastened when people start self-harming, or when they blithely gloss over everything and just say, just let us live graciously. And Goethe said, I am a liberal. Any respectable person is a liberal. But Goethe was not a liberal in practice. When he was a minister, he insisted that women who killed their children should be executed, which is the plot of Faust, and which I think the most shocking thing I ever heard. It's so in contradiction to everything, that is supposedly sort of.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Just a very brief comment on your question. Two things. So I agree with you that this creation of sub-personhood, so denying others moral status equality, is something you find in at least, I'm not so sure about the discrimination of workers, but maybe there is also evidence to it. So that it's somehow related to their bodies and so on. It is definitely related to gender inequality, and it's related to racism. What is interesting, I would say, about the case that we look into is that you have a specific normative order, liberal democracy, that maintains, or that states at least, that it somehow solved the problem of racism, namely by extending previously color-coded principles to non-white population. And so there is no systemic racism in liberal democracies from the self-understanding of this order. And this creates a particular hurdle for any protest that tries to make the claim that you have here like racism as a systemic feature. And that is where we come in and say, okay, maybe this is a hint that we can use to interpret this specific protest practice, namely self-harming, which is, if we look at the whole terrain of protest in Western democracies, I have to limit it to just, it only appears there, and with this high in these high numbers. So the second thing was your connecting like the citizenship approach with the sub-person production, and yes, but the problem with the active citizenship approach is that it assumes that this kind of exclusion, namely racism, can be solved by inclusion, by expanding the circles of those who haven't benefited yet from the promises of democracy. And of course, I'm fully with this aspiration. But if we take at least, Charles Mills, for example, seriously, then the problem of racism cannot be solved in Germany alone with democratic practices of inclusion, because Mills put it, it's a global system. So it is materialized not only through a very specific law or policy here in Germany. It is like embedded in narratives, in the material construction of economic relations, and so on and so forth. So that's why I'm kind of hesitant with this active citizenship approach. So, I have one last question for you. I found it super interesting your initial attempt was somehow, if I understood you correctly, to link pragmatism and manga. And I was wondering, like this specific style of cultural production, manga, but drawing mangas, if this somehow differs from other styles within Japanese literature and so on, because you said that your characterization of pragmatism was that it is a community of inquiry, that it softens a rigid way of looking at the world, and then manga comes as a kind of as the cultural answer to this kind of characterization. And I was wondering if there is in Japanese culture, if there is a more rigid way of literature that is somehow countered by manga as a form of cultural formation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Yeah. And I think both questions are related and can be related. And thank you very much. And you are right, but I was aware that the way I presented today can be very misleading because, for example, first of all, Tsurumi Shunsuke philosopher was, I think, was the first to thematize manga as a philosophical topic in Japan. And nowadays, there are quite a number of philosophy scholars discussing Japanese manga. And one point is that Tsurumi admits that the kind of his approach cannot explain also variety of mangas. And actually found during the 60s and 70s, when the Japanese society and the Japanese thinking became very clearly political, the kind of Tsurumi's understanding of manga as a way to unstiffen rigidity is not applicable anymore. So there are all sorts, and I think it applies even more today, I think. And so that's one point. And another point I wanted regarding the unstiffing and relating to Goethe, I realized I had to omit about many things I wanted to, include today. But one thing is that, for example, one of the central motif in the case of Mizuki is a question of the dead, and of course related to the dead soldiers during the war. And it took Mizuki for about more than 20 years to produce manga, his work, focus on the question of the dead soldiers. But I think one of the scholars clearly points out that, for example, as I said, the main characters are the very strange supernatural creatures or ghosts or the dead people in his manga. And so this is a sort of a gaze from the other world. So in terms of the space, I think in addition to the intra-mundane spatial divisions, I think in the case of the Mizuki, there's a gaze of the coming from the dead and the very strange, the creatures, invisible. So I think in that sense, I think this is a very well-known, interesting anecdote. That is, Tezuka Osamu had a very small kid, and his kid really became fascinated by Mizuki's mangas about ghosts, and so there is a sort of Tezuka's world, manga world, is basically a very positive and future-oriented, but Mizuki's world is extending toward the invisible world of the dead. And so the emphasis is that there are some scholars emphasizing this point, that we sense when we read his very bizarre manga that this mundane world of reality is not the only world existing. So there's a gaze of we sense the invisible sort of world and dead people especially. So in this sense, it can another way to stretch our attitude toward this world. So in this sense, I think And so this is, in this sense, I think the kind of manga Mizuki presented could have a much stronger sort of attraction, fascination, not only for adults, but also for the children. And just one quick point, exactly, you are right. But I think, Goethe lived died in the early 19th century, so different time. But these young Japanese people going through the war times did not know, did not care about the historical background in which Goethe himself lived as a person. So what is interesting is that I think, as you said, Goethe is such a comprehensive and very contradictory person. And so very different artists, Tezuka and Mizuki, both were attracted to a different side. But I think both of them sensed the sort of affirmation of life at the bottom. And that comes out, I think, through contrasting Tezuka and Mizuki. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. And thank you all on Zoom as well. It's been a long, but very interesting and productive session. And I'm sorry we just went bulldozed over without a break, but it was very good. And then sorry, you must have had a little bit of a jet lag, but it was great because everybody stayed focused. And thank you for all the participants on Zoom. Thank you for coming, and then we'll close the evening. Yeah.
Thank you very much.